Hey, Dr. C here. Welcome to Lesson 11. In this lesson, we're going to be covering DEA registrations. And in your books, this is pages 64 through 67. So the whole system of DEA regulation of controlled substances is based on a closed system of controlled substance distribution. The idea is that every person who handles controlled substances in a legitimate supply chain is registered with the DEA so they can track where these drugs are going until it gets to the ultimate user based on a valid prescription. At that point, the individual user patient doesn't have to be registered. But this involves anyone who manufactures, distributes, dispenses, does research, imports, exports, all these different types of what DEA calls different types of business activities actually require a different type of DEA registration. Many states have a state-controlled substance registration as well, sometimes with the Board of Pharmacy, sometimes with a different state-controlled substance agency. However, in Florida, there is no state-controlled substance registration, so all a pharmacy has to do is register with the DEA in order to possess and dispense controlled substances. So we'll talk in a moment about the other types of classes of business activities that get DEA registrations, but I want to first focus on dispensers because dispenser registrations are what pharmacies get, but dispenser registrations are also what practitioners or prescribers get as well. Interestingly enough, there's not a separate category that divides up prescribers and dispensers. Both prescribers and dispensers fall under the dispenser category. And the dispenser registration, since that's the bulk of DEA registrations, as opposed to manufacturers and wholesalers and researchers and other ones, those are renewed every 3 years, while those other categories are actually renewed on an annual basis. And the renewal, the registration form to do that, we'll cover in a moment, is DEA Form 224. The dispenser registrations start with the letter A, B, or F. There's also one that starts with the letter G, but that's for a Department of Defense contractors. I don't think you need to worry about that. But all pharmacies and all prescribers are going to start with either the letter A, B, or F. And then the second letter of the DEA registration corresponds to the first letter of the registrant's last name. So if it's an individual registrant, like a prescriber, a physician, or a dentist, it should be the first letter of that person's last name. If it's an entity or a business, like a pharmacy or a hospital, it should be the first letter of the name of that business. Now, sometimes the name of the business, the legal name may not match the doing business name. So if it doesn't match exactly, that could be the reason, because the incorporated name could be different than the name that the company's doing business under. There are prescribers that are called mid-level practitioners that have DEA numbers that all start with the letter M, and these are primarily your advanced practice registered nurses. There's other types of what DEA considers mid-level practitioner registrations that are given to animal shelters and veterinary euthanasia technicians as well, but more likely where you're going to see that type of registration with the letter M in pharmacy practice would be with advanced practice registered nurses and physician assistants. Now I know it's kind of small on the screen here, but I was able to find a sample DEA registration, but this one you'll notice is for a researcher, not for a dispenser, and actually it lists the schedules of controlled substance this registrant is allowed to possess, and because it's a researcher, they actually have Schedule 1, which is kind of interesting. Normally you're not going to see somebody that has authority to have Schedule 1 drugs, but it does list the other schedules there, 2, 3, 3N, 4, and 5. And the curious thing about having an N in there, a lot of people wonder what that is. DEA divides the narcotics and the non-narcotic drugs, like we talked about in the last lesson. So a lot of people think the N actually stands for narcotic, but actually it stands for non-narcotics. So if you've got 3, it means you can do the narcotics in 3, and 3N means the non-narcotics. This one, interesting enough, does not have the 2 non-narcotics, so they couldn't have amphetamine. But most pharmacies and most prescribers are going to have 2, 2N, 3, 3N, 4, and 5 in their registration. Okay, so as I mentioned, the type of registration depends on the type of activity you're doing, and in this closed system of distribution, everyone who receives or distributes controlled substances has to be registered with the DEA. And that includes manufacturers, distributors, reverse distributors, which we'll talk about later, dispensers, as we talked about already, researchers, narcotic treatment programs is a separate type of DEA registration, people doing chemical analysis, importers, exporters. DEA has proposed a new type of registration for emergency medical services agencies. I don't think that's been finalized, even though it's been proposed since 2020. It takes a DEA a long time once they propose a rule to actually finalize it. So on page 65 is a formula for verifying a DEA registration. This is something that could show up on the MPJE. It's kind of old-fashioned because your computers probably check this automatically. You can also go to the DEA's website, enter a DEA number, and I'll tell you whether or not it's valid or not. But this formula was supposed to prevent fraudulent prescriptions. You should know how to do this, and the way you do this with the numbers following the 2 letters is you add in step 1 the first, third, and fifth digits. In step 2 you add the second, fourth, and sixth digits. Actually, and on the slide there, I forgot to put, you add the second, fourth, and sixth digits and multiply that number times 2, as it shows you in the book. And then you add step 1 and step 2, and the last digit of your total would be the last number of the DEA number to show it's a valid number. So it's kind of a tricky thing, so people can't fake DEA numbers, but you should know how to do that in case you get a question on it. So one of the keys to this closed system of distribution is there are separate registrations required for each separate location. That means every pharmacy should have its own DEA registration. Even if they have a chain pharmacy, a chain pharmacy doesn't get one DEA registration for every pharmacy in the chain. Every location gets its own DEA registration. This is primarily done by address. DEA will sometimes provide what's called a campus registration that includes multiple buildings, and it could be at different addresses, but this is done on a case-by-case basis. So if you're at a hospital that has multiple buildings and you want one DEA registration to cover all of these buildings, you need to work closely with your local DEA office and verify what exactly is covered by that DEA registration, because if they're not connected, it might be difficult to do that. So I mention this also because I can't tell you how many times in my career I came across people that forgot, pharmacists, good pharmacists, that forget this basic concept of separate registrations for separate locations, and they may be working at a hospital that's got an off-site clinic that's 2 miles away, and they want to treat it like a department of the hospital. But if it's 2 miles away and not connected to the hospital, it's going to need its own separate DEA registration. And because of that, if you send other controlled substances over there, you're going to have to do the proper record keeping, transferring from one DEA registration to another. Now, for individual practitioners or prescribers, they can practice at multiple locations and write prescriptions for controlled substances under a single DEA registration. Because sometimes they have multiple, clinics where they work, and that's okay if they're simply writing controlled or issuing controlled substance prescriptions from multiple locations. But if they're going to store controlled substances at a location, maybe for use in their office, then each individual location would have to have a separate DEA registration. And also, if they're working at different locations that are in different states, they'd have to have a separate DEA registration, even if they're only prescribing in those locations. Because if they're in separate states, they require separate DEA registrations, because DEA registrations and the authority to prescribe is based on state law. So DEA would require a separate DEA registration. Let's say you have a practitioner that has an office in Georgia and also in Florida, where they practice half the time. They would have to have a separate registration both for the Georgia location and the Florida location. If they're within two different cities in Florida that they're operating out of, and they're only prescribing and not storing drugs at those separate locations, they would not need a separate DEA registration. So on the bottom of page 65 is some information about the application for registration. The form for this is a DEA 224 form. It's something that they could ask you. This is for dispensers. The application has to be signed, and you can apply for this online as well, by the registrant. Okay, so if that's an individual, if it's a physician trying to get DEA registration, the physician would have to sign the application. If it's a partnership, one of the partners would have to sign, and if it's a corporation, an officer of the corporation would have to sign the application. Now, sometimes you got a big organization, and a corporate officer doesn't want to be involved in signing the DEA registration application, so one of the corporate officers could then authorize another individual to sign the application and the renewal forms every 3 years by filling out what's called a power of attorney. And the power of attorney then authorizes someone else, let's say the director of pharmacy at a hospital or something, to sign the application for the DEA registration and the renewal forms. This particular power of attorney, we're going to talk about some other power of attorneys later, actually has to be filed with the DEA. Later on, we'll talk about a power of attorney to order Schedule II drugs. That one does not have to be filed with the DEA. Now, there are some exemptions of people who do not have to register with DEA that are allowed to either handle or possess controlled substances. The first exemption are agents or employees of a registrant. Who would that be? That would be pharmacists, because individual pharmacists, at least in Florida, don't have any prescriptive authority, so they don't get individual DEA registrations. The pharmacy is considered the dispenser and has a DEA registration, and you as a pharmacist are an employee of that registrant. You as an individual don't have your own DEA registration number. Same thing with nurses in a hospital that are administering controlled substances are not individually registered with DEA unless they're an advanced practice nurse and they're actually doing some prescribing. And this also would include delivery people and so forth. And there's also an exemption for, as you'll see, number 2 on page 66, common carriers. So, you know, if you're sending something by UPS, the UPS person, they may not know they have controlled substances in there, but they're not in illegal possession of the controlled substances. Obviously, the ultimate user, the patient, doesn't have to be registered with the DEA. And there's also exemptions for officials in the armed services, public health services, and the Bureau of Prisons. I will say, and this is in the note on page 66, although these military personnel, military physicians, and so forth are actually exempt from having to register with the DEA, and you could fill prescriptions issued by such a practitioner, it gets difficult if those prescriptions are going outside of the military base or something like that, because most pharmacy systems won't allow you to enter a prescription or dispense a prescription unless you have a DEA registration. So for that reason, I do think that a lot of the military physicians and so forth will go ahead and apply for a DEA registration just to make their life a lot easier. Practitioners' use of a hospital DEA number, this is sort of like another exemption, but what this is saying is that if you've got interns or residents, which are physicians in training at a hospital, they don't have to have their own DEA registration in order to treat patients and order controlled substances for those patients, or even write prescriptions for outpatients that they see while they're at the hospital. They can use the hospital's DEA number as long as the hospital uses some type of internal code, which is a suffix added onto the end of the hospital's DEA number, to indicate which intern or resident actually did the prescribing. Just in case there's a problem, they can track it down to the actual individual. And these prescriptions that you get can be filled outside of the hospital at a pharmacy that's not affiliated with the hospital. So you might get a controlled substance prescription issued by an intern or a resident, particularly if you're near a teaching hospital, that's using the hospital's DEA number with some type of suffix at the end to indicate who the prescriber actually is. Temporary use on page 67, temporary use of a pharmacy's DEA registration. This is a mechanism when you're selling a pharmacy that permits the new owner to temporarily use the previous owner's DEA registration. In the study tip there on the bottom of the page, it tells you this is kind of an interesting one because it's not really in a rule anywhere with DEA, but it was authorized in a policy letter, a long time ago. But it's so well known that I think you need to know about it in case you have to do this in your career. But they could also ask you a question on this on the MPJE. To do this, you have to grant the new owner the authority to use your DEA registration number and to also sign DEA order forms using a power of attorney. And there's specific requirements that have to be in the power of attorney that are listed for you on page 67. One thing tricky with this is that the previous owner of the pharmacy still remains responsible and accountable because it's still their DEA number. So if you're going to do this, you want to make sure you're selling your pharmacy to someone that you can trust, because you're still ultimately going to be responsible if any diversion's happening after you sell the pharmacy. The original policy letter that authorized this by DEA said that you can only do this for 45 days. I'm not sure that's still, I put a question mark on the slide there because I'm not sure this is still in effect. I know some DEA offices said you can go longer than 45 days. But if you have a question on it and you have to pick a time limit, I would pick 45 days because that's what the original letter that authorized this said. Okay, and with that, we are done with the DEA registration section, lesson 11.